Swami Vivekananda's ideas, ideology, and relevance are discussed and debated a lot even today. Makarand Paranjape, the director of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, and Dr. S.Y. Subramaniam, the Vice Chancellor of Shastra deemed to be university, will discuss the sage's modernity of tradition in a conversation with the New Indian Express's editorial director Prabhu Chawla.
Welcome, gentlemen. I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question, which is, of course, to Makarand Paranjape. Swami Vivekananda is so many things to so many people. To me, he's really like a self-help guru. All his writings, all his teachings. There's so much in them. Of how to live your life, how to have strength, how to overcome weakness. But of course, he is relevant to education as a whole, and I think Indian education as a whole, and the way you have interpreted him and updated him, as he interpreted and updated traditional Hinduism, has been quite remarkable. So I want to put it to you, Makarand, how is he so relevant in so many ways? Whether it is the way he looks at religion, whether it is the way he looks at caste, or whether it's the way he looks at that whole idea of the Islamic body and the Vedanta mind. There's so many ideas in his philosophy which are so relevant. So where do we start? You tell us.
I guess we can start with the topic of today's discussion, which is education.
Yes.
And in this book that you were mentioning, I think it's called Hinduism and India's Road to Modernity.
Yes.
Swami Vivekananda, Hinduism and India's Road to Modernity. You know, I've got a chapter on national education.
Right.
And the idea is, and the subtitle is Man Making Among the Colonized.
Yeah.
Of course, man making includes, woman making, because the things that...
sensitive issue here.
No, but he was a great feminist as well. I think Makarand will talk about that.
It was. In fact, in his ideas on education, he emphasized that women should be educated, because if you educate one woman, you're educating an entire family. So, and we are talking about a time when literacy among the women in India around the end of the 19th century was less than 1%. In fact, it was closer to 0.8% if you look at some statistics. So he was quite a pioneer in that respect. But I just wanted to mention, since our program is in some ways related, to Tamil Nadu, Shastra universities there, and the New Indian Express is also, it also comes out from the south a lot, Chennai. There is a wonderful book, a small book called Education, compiled from the speeches and writings of Swami Vivekananda. This has been written by T.S. Avinashilingam. Now, the reason I bring this up is because later on, T.S. Avinashilingam went on to become the first education minister of Tamil Nadu. And the first thing he did was to bring in Tamil medium instruction, which was not there at all. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when he was in jail during the Quit India movement, Avinashilingam did a compilation, taking excerpts from Swamiji's extensive writings. In fact, at that time, 9 volumes were not out, some 6, 7 volumes were out. And he compiled it into this little booklet, which is still relevant. The reason I mention this is obviously Swamiji's ideas on education are scattered throughout his writings, and he was very passionate about it. But I think I've given the clue to the overall idea of Swamiji, which is basically he wanted a national education, which later Sri Aurobindo and others picked up. But he also wanted an education which I would call the Tattvamasi model of education. What is this Tattvamasi model as opposed to Tattvam Nasmi? That is, I'm not, Nasti, I'm not that. I am that. Tattvamasi as opposed to I'm not that model of education. Whatever, we can unpack that Mahavakya from the Upanishads. But the basic point that Swamiji was making is that education is the perfection already manifest within us. So that's completely different from the idea that we got from the West, which is from Locke and others, John Locke, that the mind is a tabula rasa, and you've got to inscribe like an empty slate, you write things on it. And even today, we stuff the mind with information, and in a way, it's a kind of brainwashing. Now, I know other people want to say important things here, so I'm not going to keep talking. But the thing I wanted to really emphasize is that if you look at the last quarter of the 19th century and right up to 1950s, there were a whole host of experiments in the area of education in India. You know, it's not just Swamiji. Before him, there was Rabindranath Tagore. After Swamiji, there was Gandhi, who talked about Nai Talim. Shri Krishna, Sri Aurobindo and the mother talked about free progress. Jiddu Krishnamurti talked about education a lot. And, right till today, we are experimenting with education. Chinmaya Mission has many schools. And before that, let's not forget Dayanand Saraswati, okay, who started this Anglo Vedic model, as it later came to be called DAV. And perhaps Mr. Chawla himself studied in one of those institutions. I don't know. But it was a very influential type of model all over North India. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that it was not accidental that all these great thought leaders, savants, educators, even women like, I say even because Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, a real strong pioneering women who converted to Christianity, though she was a Vidushi. Anyhow, now, all these people got into this field of education because they believed it was the key to transformation. On the one hand, it was the key to winning our freedom, being decolonized, getting rid of the British, but not just political freedom absorbed their energies and attention. They wanted human transformation on a scale unimagined before. So it was about a consciousness revolution. And they believed that the right kind of education would release the energies of the slumbering masses of India, who had been deprived for 1,000 years after the fall of Nalanda. We had never had a big university in India. We're talking about 1193, 94, when I don't want to use a negative terminology, but many of our institutions were really destroyed. And about Nalanda, it is said that there were so many manuscripts and books there that when it was set on fire, and you can still see the walls of the old Nalanda scorched with flames, that they are blackened even today after excavation. So it was smoldering and burning for months on end. Of course, luckily, some of the valuable tomes and granthas and manuscripts were taken to Tibet. So to conclude what I'm trying to say in this part, I feel that all of these great thought leaders, freedom fighters, as well as spiritual leaders of India wanted to transform not just India, but the world through a new type of education. And among these, certainly Swamiji was one of the pioneers.
Dr. Vaidya, would you like to take over from here?
Yeah. So before I just ask the next question, I just want to relate to what Prabhakaran was saying, because I also am deeply impacted by the thoughts of Swami Vivekananda, and this book, My India, which is a selection of his own writings, the India Eternal. He talks so much about education. And for Swami Vivekananda, for many of us, we see him as a very spiritually tall global Indian who thought ahead of the times. And today we still talk about his speech in the World Parliament of Religions, when actually the purpose of that was actually to establish a supremacy of a different order. He completely changed the narrative, the discourse that was happening in that particular event. And it was his view of India that actually brought India to forefront. So the way in which people started looking at India was completely changed after his discourse. Now, that is the real purpose of education for me, because I want India to be seen by the world through the lens of Indians who have understood the virtuous value of education, which presents the right perspective of India to the world, not an India that is taught by those outside India. Maybe they are right, maybe they are wrong, but definitely, there is some gap in the understanding perspective. So if the purpose of education, in my view, is to create enlightened individuals who can understand India and present India to the world, as India gains this leadership position, now, are we really building those types of educational institutions in our country? Now, having said that as the backdrop, Dr. Makarand, I just want to further ask you and take this discussion forward. What would you think is, you know, your idea of Indian education? Is it first to ensure that the massification of education that we see today has also created a massification of the right thought of what true India is? Or are we just blindly running a race where we are just trying to make Indian education, go global, but not actually Indian in the real sense it has to be?
Exactly. I think the foundation of Indian pedagogy, if you want to use that word, was a deep inquiry into the self, and this ought to result in a transformation, not just in a narrow sense, but a transformation of personality and character. So if you look at the very first so-called convocation or valediction address, going back to the Chandogya Upanishad, that's when the teacher says, Satyam Vada Dharmam Chara. So Swamiji says that education is not the massification, to use your word, Dr. Vaidya. It's not a massification of information with the mind being a passive recipient, cramming things and then regurgitating them, because this was already happening. By the time Swamiji was a student at Presidency University, or college rather, it was Hindu college founded by Ram Mohan Roy and other people, very leading citizens of Bengal in around 1819, 1818, thereabouts. And then it became Presidency College. So he himself studied there. Then he went to Scottish Mission College and he found that our entire pattern of modern education was an imitation of Western texts, curricula, and teaching methodologies. And today we talk about, I have taught at JNU, for the last 20 plus years, and we see the kind of youth we are producing. Some people call them the Tukde gang. But this goes right back to young Bengal, because the Derosians were also, people who took to questioning the so-called traditions. They were very rebellious, and a bit of it is good, because even Swamiji was a great rebel. But there's an apocryphal story of one of these Derosians. A lot of them, they turned their back on their own ancestral practices and faith. And, the father, told one of the Derosians that, before you go to college, do your pranam to the family deity, who was Kali. So he goes to the shrine and says, "Good morning, madam." And then he is off to college. And then at night, they have these beef parties. Now, again, I'm not talking about anybody's dietary habits, but somehow the idea that young people should be rebellious, and they should be rebellious in a certain manner, which is, in a sense, irreverent, produces a certain kind of individual. And Swamiji is saying rather that education is not the massification of information, but the building of character. Now, are we building character today? People laugh if you tell somebody that go to college to build your character. They laugh, because you go to college to lose your character. Whatever little character or values you may have, those will disappear. And all that will happen is that a superficial understanding, like even today, there are 100 people who have written in favor, of a particular freedom of expression and this and that at an elite Indian institution, which I shall not name, as if all that is important is to preserve. Of course, freedom is important. Please don't misunderstand me. But to preserve some artificial notion of freedom of expression to the extent that you have turned the entire institution, more or less, not that particular one, but even the one where I taught, into a platform to attack a particular ideology, a particular party, or frankly, even a particular leader. So Swamiji is saying that that is not the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to know yourself in the deep sense. And going back to the Chandogya Upanishad, when after spending 12 years with the guru, when the shishya comes back, the father asks him, what have you learned? And that is where the point comes up, for discussion, which is that what our Upanishads are saying, and what the knowledge traditions of India are saying, what the wisdom traditions of India are saying, which is so relevant today, is that, this world that is outside us, so to speak, the external world, of which even science is obsessed through measurement and calibration to get a grip upon, that world and we ourselves are actually not just interlinked, but there is a unity of consciousness. Isha vasyam idam sarvam yat kincha jagatyan jagat. So once you see the interrelationship between, the individual and the cosmos, it also includes the interrelationship between one individual and another, that is, social arrangements, political arrangements. It also includes relations with genders. These are not oppositional. Relation between generations, again, the last generation and my generation, what we may call tradition and modernity. It's not an oppositional relationship. The relationship between man and nature, that is the human, world and the natural world, the world of Prakriti. So this is not oppositional. Prakriti and Parmeshwar are not oppositional. So this is so relevant today because today we are talking about AI replacing human teaching. So you don't need, information is easily available. You don't need a teacher. Google can give you better information sometimes. Often it's also erroneous, but many times you can get good information on the World Wide Web. Okay. So the teacher is not to give information. A teacher is to facilitate. Post-Renaissance model of education that we have inherited posits man and nature. Man and man is Marx, okay? Because it's a social conflict between classes which drives the engine of history. Man and nature is the classical conflict brought about by modern science, where you want to conquer and control nature. Man and woman, feminism, man and God, Nietzsche, and so on. So what has it resulted in? It has resulted in a fractured world, fractured human society, an environmental crisis, and ultimately a schizophrenic modern Indian, who doesn't know, what his connection with his own past is, whether he wants to belong to some kind of universal Western modern civilization or whether he wants to go back to what he doesn't realize or understand, he or she. So the reason why Swamiji is so important is that he takes us beyond the idea of education as garnering of information or skills. He takes us beyond the idea of education as being merely some sort of, livelihood, training that you get some skill, you get some profession, and earn a living. But he goes into an integral idea of education, which I would call Atmanization. Education is the process of Atmanization, which is to say that to understand who you are and to see the unity of consciousness, the unity of the cosmos, and also to build, the character and conduct which are conducive to individual and social transformation.
I'll intervene here, if you allow me, please. Dr. Vidya, with your permission, Makarand, I must make it clear that when we started the Think Education Conclave, idea behind was very clear. We used to call it how to Indianize Indian education. For 9 years, we will be discussing that. How do we convert India into Indian education? Because what is happening now, that you refer to about universality of education, what is happening during the last past 100 and 150 years, that from Western concept of education is trying to impose a universal model of education all over the world. You speak the same language, the same kind of accent, you must read the same kind of books, and you start thinking similarity. Because universe or India, or not India, universe is diversified. You have people from Japan to USA. USA is not a country, it's a country of every nationality. But the attempt has been made. India has been victim because the Britishers dominated here for 200 years. And we call it system of education, massification, you call it, or you want to call it, whatever you want to call it. But somehow, even during the past 70 years, this cartelization, or you'll call the monopolization of education system by certain views who were, because going to Oxford or going to England was a badge of honor. Even now, people flaunt it that I have studied in Harvard, and I have studied it. In our education system, in the basic education, what you're talking about, Vivekananda and various other people you have named, in the school education, none of them is talked about. My grandchildren are looking at it, they're studying in a school which is much more Indianized than many other schools, but still they read more Harry Potter than anybody else. They read Shakespeare, but nobody has told them to read Vivekananda. The question is that where is something, there's a fault line lies with us who are part of the administration. And Professor Vaidya is here. In his universities, I don't know how much Indianization or Hinduization, I won't call it, because Kaveri is getting angry there and literalization, because I'm saying Bharatiya Karan jo hai, Bharat is India, because I ask the question even to Prime Minister and Narasimha Rao, first I asked that question. So why a country, India, is perhaps one of the very few countries, it has two names, one Bharat, one India. And that differentiates the whole problem here, because India thinks differently than what Bharat thinks. And therefore, this is a conflict going on in the education system as well. Because Indianization of Indian system, where Indian value system, from the Chedar and everything which you're talking about, ask only anybody from the primary school. Nobody ever heard about it. And we have made no attempts to tell them that we have a rich heritage of literature, which nobody else perhaps got it. So where are the fault lines in our people who want to be part of the Western universal culture? And what is happening economically here also. Even the economic model, the management model is being imposed what it taught at Harvard, and what it taught there. Everybody thinking alike. Everybody talks about PPP model, which you never heard. It's not an Indian concept. So everybody is being imposed is a fashion. So how can we dismantle the fashionable strategy of keeping the Indian education slave to the Western way of thinking?
Well, I think you have already partly answered the question. I would only add that the process of decolonization is not as simple as it seems, because sometimes you throw the baby with the bathwater, you know. The fact is that we have a lot to learn from the West, and Swamiji was the first one to admit it. You know, when he went to the United States, he was actually stunned by the extent to which they had progressed materially. And many of their, should I say, social parameters were better than ours. Though, of course, there was tremendous racism that just come out of slavery, and there was no civil rights when he was there. That happened almost 100 years later in the 1960s. And he was often taken to be an African American and denied lodging also. So he saw that prejudice, but the status of women was much better than in India. And there was a lot to learn from the West in terms of their science, technology, and many other achievements. And Swamiji embraced that. So there was no artificial conflict in his mind. He never thought that being Indian means to reject modernity, to reject science and technology. No. But I think he understood, as a few of us have understood and believed, including Mahatma Gandhi, that the paradigm of civilization that the modern West has created is ultimately self destructive. If you read Hind Swaraj, that is what he's saying. And we, every day, you see this whole economic crisis, energy crisis, ecological crisis, all of these point to the fact that, you know, without dharma, without moksha, just kama and artha will lead to an asuric civilization and self destruction. So, the point about what Swamiji was trying to say, the point that you're also raising, to Indianize Indian education is not just to reject the West with some kind of knee jerk reaction, nor is it, you know, like some people say, you just have to adopt, you throw out English, you learn Sanskrit, or you learn English, or sorry, Hindi. You know, that won't do, because most of the modern paribhashik shabdavali, what we call the technical vocabulary, in any Indian language is translated from English. Okay. So to understand who we are, to understand modernity and the West, and to find a way, I won't call it a cheap synthesis, because many things are incommensurate. You can't synthesize oil and water. They will not mix. You can't synthesize, so to speak. I mean, this is bad chemistry. I'm not a chemist. I'm just giving you metaphors. You can't synthesize sand and sugar. They're not going to mix. But you have to find a way, through which, because see, a knee jerk rejection of what we have gathered with great difficulty, a rejection of that will make us a nation of ignoramuses. Shut down the IITs, shut down this, break this down, destroy this. This is a new kind of khilji attitude, in my view. So you need a lot of depth, cultural depth, intellectual depth, and not just slogans to understand. And this great cultural depth that I'm talking about can't come through artificial intelligence or through computers alone, but needs teachers. And again, to go back to Swami Vivekananda, he actually believes in the Guru Shishya model. Okay. He says, unless you come in close contact with someone who can inspire you with his or her example, you will not be transformed. You'll get some information, but your being will not be altered. So it's like being in touch with a live wire. So it is some of these deeper things we've got to look at. And I must say one more thing, that if you look at the national education policy, there are many good things in it. Okay, we must applaud it. There's lots of freedom, lots of flexibility, lots of autonomy, learning in our own languages, and so on. But the important thing is somehow our emphasis when it comes to education is still technical education. We somehow feel that, and though I agree, I mean, I'm myself taught at IIT Delhi, and I'm a great believer of the IIT system and the way they nurture and mentor other IITs, like Mumbai IIT mentored, for example, Indore IIT. So their system is very robust, and actually,
but I'll interrupt because they're creating uniformity of IITs. The
that's
same
it.
culture. That's the culture.
That is why I'm saying that won't do. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. And the point I'm trying to make is that to have deep cognition, you need language skills of a high order. For the ancient Indians, the model of knowledge was not mathematics as with the Greeks. It was Vyakran, our greatest and ancient text. If you leave aside the Vedas, it's actually Panini. It's actually, our Vyakran traditions are very of the highest order. Even today, Sanskrit, Paninian grammar is the model for machine language and much else. So for deep cognition, you need language. And unfortunately today, no young person knows any language very well. I'd be very happy if your grandchildren know Shakespeare well. But my experience, I've been, as I said, teaching in one of the leading Indian universities. ना तो हिंदी आती है, ना अंग्रेजी आती है, ना Tamil. They don't know Tamil. They don't know Kannada properly. What they know is this, they take a smartphone, they can gather some things, they know an app, they download an app, and then they can give you some information. But that's not enough. For a civilization to reboot, which is what we are trying to do, after centuries of varying kinds of slavery, and Kaveri is here, the fountainhead of Indian knowledge traditions was Kashmir. And when Kashmir was destroyed, there was a huge loss. And some people fled to Banaras, some people fled to Tibet, and so forth. So there has been a destruction of the Indian knowledge society. We are a knowledge society. We exported knowledge forever until the last few hundred years. And now, we want to be Jagat Guru again, but we have to actually do some introspection, Atma Nigrani, whatever you want to call it, Atma Nirikshan, Atma Samiksha, all this is required. And, our institutions are being destroyed even as we speak. And that is why Dr. Vaidya and others are important, because, the private sector is filling a vacuum. Look at our public institutions. Look at our great institutions. I will name them since I come from one of them. I'm teaching there, though I didn't study there. JNU, DU, Shantiniketan, Vishwabharati, BHU, Central University of Hyderabad. They are all going through a crisis. There's a leadership crisis. There's a crisis in academics, in recruitment, and we have tied ourselves into knots. We have a complicated policy for both recruitment of students and staff, which is as complicated as the caste system. There are all kinds of quotas. Excellence is never an issue. Issue meaning it's not even a consideration. It's have you filled this quota? Have you filled that quota? And if you don't fill a quota, then they're going to come and bash you up. Okay. So you cannot generate leadership in thought. You cannot generate excellence for a new generation. You cannot create exemplars. You cannot create the kind of gurus who will inspire others when you have tied yourself into knots. And just as we destroyed the public sector so that the private people could do well, BSNL, VSNL, name it, Air India, everywhere, you sell national assets. I predict that soon, you will not want to send your children to state funded universities because you're not sure of the curriculum, you're not sure of the teaching standards, you're not sure if the semester will take place as scheduled, and therefore, again, the Harvards and the Yales and the Columbias will come in, they'll set up shop in India, and once again, you will open a door to a recolonization of India, a reorientalization of India, So these are the dangers. And therefore, we need political will, we need great capacity building, we need integrity, not ideology alone. Today, it's very fashionable, to spout an ideology to justify incompetence. Ideologies cannot paper over incompetence. We need to create highly competent people who will thrive in our educational institutions. Now they are being harassed, silenced, bullied, boycotted, branded, etc. All this is going on. And you see what's happening at the school level. Who will send their child to a government school? I'm in Himachal Pradesh. Government schools are running empty. It's a small state, less than 10 million people. And of course, a huge amount of your money and my money, taxpayers' money, is going down the tube. So, putting out a national education policy is not enough. We have to reform root and branch. And there has to be a national consensus for this, which we have yet to build, I'm afraid. So we will continue to tinker and talk about changing this and that, but we are very far from creating institutions which can compete globally and yet offer something which is nationally relevant. Because we have a unique, as I said, tradition, of knowledge building. We have built philosophies which are so incredible. Even Himalayan Buddhism has 20 siddhantas, just Himalayan Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism. If you take the arc from Ladakh to Arunachal, we don't know anything about these traditions, hardly anything. And these are traditions which have the capacity to transform individuals, as well as bring peace of mind to communities. In Corona, people are turning to these techniques and practices. And this is some of the things Swamiji talks about here, that you may know a lot about a particular discipline, but if you don't know yourself, you're not an educated person.
Right. Dr. Vaidya?
Yeah. Another very fascinating aspect of Swami Vivekananda was that he was a predictive spiritual leader. In fact, to make my statement good, he was the one after his 1893 speech, and it happened in Chennai in 1897. And he just said, I close my eyes and I can see Bharat Mata, free. And what he meant was he's seeing Bharat Mata free, and that's going to happen in the next 50 years. And India got its political freedom, Indian independence in 1947. So he predicted the Indian independence. And likewise, he was the one whose prognosis actually was, the proletariat revolution. Actually, he thought that it will happen either in Russia or China, much against a contrarian perspective that felt that strong trade unionized countries like England, that's where these revolutions will happen. But true to Swamiji's prediction, it happened in an agrarian economy like Russia. The third thing that he predicted was that India is going to be a superpower very soon. And that somehow aligns with our discussion today, that it to become a superpower, you cannot isolate education, because that's the quintessence of any country's progress. And since you also mentioned Hind Swaraj, when Gandhiji wrote that in 1908, and again, he had a chance to revisit the book in 1938. And when somebody asked him whether you want to change something, he said he couldn't even change a single word, because he didn't see anything change happening in those years. But that's not the case here. Now, if Swami Vivekananda were to come again, and then we ask him the question, what do you like to change in the education system that you could make India a superpower again? And given the Atmanization that you have spoken about, and the nuggets of that clearly visible in the Atmanirbhar Bharat, and education is also a focal piece, a frontal piece in that. If Swami Vivekananda comes again today, what would you think that he would have as the top three that Indian education system has to do to answer Mr. Prabhuchala's question? We have also been searching an answer for this question for the last 10 years. You Indianize Indian education, and you've said that it is not just neglecting certain and adopting certain things, but then it's beyond that. Now, given the fact that the new education policy is here, Atmanirbhar is here, I mean, these are all, terminological policy waves that are getting created. But in the policy wave, how can you ensure that the ecosystem finds a place to reach and thereby grow from there? Otherwise, we keep changing very often. We haven't even tasted success of these initiatives in the last 50, 60 years, because there is an accelerated pace with which policy has changed. We should stop. And if we are stopping now, how would we reboot, restart, in your own words? What top three things, as Swami Vivekananda, would you advise the policymakers?
Well, I dare not, try to step into his shoes. But from my own humble experience, all my life I've done nothing else but study and teach. I'm probably not fit for anything else. So, I mean, as soon as I finished, my PhD, I started teaching. I was teaching before I finished my PhD as a teaching assistant. I was teaching from the age of about, I would say, 19. And that's all I've done all my life. So I can tell you that we need massive root and branch reform. We have to rethink the reservation system. That doesn't mean that we do not have affirmative action of some kind, but trying to compensate past wrongs with present entitlements does not serve the cause of either natural justice or distributive justice. This is a political, should I say, compulsion. I don't know who will beard the lion. I don't know who is going to take this up. And I doubt whether anybody has the courage to talk about this, let alone to start a reform of this process. And this divides society, it creates tremendous resentment, and it's also very unfair to the so called impoverished sections of the forward classes. There are some highly impoverished sections, and you can't then have one more reservation, which we've done now, for economically deprived, backward classes. One more reservation. So more reservation and even more to compensate for the wrong of an earlier reservation. And it's going to lead to, I think, a dominoes effect. And I will not be surprised if you have reservation over 100%, because these numbers don't matter now. Because over and above 100%, then you'll have one more special quota. So this is how we are playing with the future of our nation. If we are honest and sincere, we should re-examine it. Secondly, we need curricular reform. Now, curricular reform also requires courage, because in certain subjects, the books are full of lies. If you look at a NCERT textbook for the 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, they are full of mistakes, lies. Somebody talked earlier about narrative. I think Mr. Chawla talked about. So this, all kinds of falsehoods are being peddled in the name of authorized and established histories. And we are so obsessed, with content. We should be focusing on critical thinking. So, of course, curricular reform is important, but I tell my friends, you're fighting, it's almost like a life and death battle to get some history book changed. But try and get the evaluation changed. You know what happens now is if you write an answer which is different from that answer in the prescribed textbook, you get zero. So, what you've got to do is you've got to allow a person to have a different answer and yet be correct. Because all answers can be correct, depends on how you argue. So, where is the emphasis on creativity and critical thinking? So, curricular reform, then pedagogical reform. And frankly, get the government out of this. I've been saying for primary education, there are certain successful models. There are well established philanthropic and other foundations which are national minded. Have a public private partnership, set benchmarks. This system of government controlled school education is so much money down the drain. There are teachers in certain states who were asked, your school is in some remote district. Why are you staying in the state capital? He says, for my children's education, it's better for me to stay here. You see, so they're getting paid, but they're not teaching. They go once a month and they fill out a roster. So when we talk about digital India and all, we have to stop these malpractices and you get the government out of some of this, and and yet where investment is required. Government should be in the business, of ensuring, I mean, to have some regulation so that fly by night operators don't cheat people. You don't have a small should I say Barsati, and on top of that you say international management school jobs guaranteed. This is what's going on. So, you have complete lack of regulation at one end of the spectrum where people are being exploited, and at the other end, over regulation. You've done right to education, but this only seems to apply to certain kinds of communities, certain kinds of schools, and even the schools which exist will be shut down now because they don't meet those parameters. So you see, so much needs to be done, and I think we need to face the facts. We are not excellent in any today. I can say with certainty, we are not excellent in any department of education. If you have any world parameters, we don't have a top university in India. IISC is an exception, but even then, it's in the top 100 or something. Its rank is very low for a country of our size. Even our IITs, see, I have taught at an IIT. It's our students who are brilliant. What we do is we export mindware, we export manpower and woman power. We have not invented anything in the last 100 years, hardly anything. So we must come to terms with all this and not have a false notion of who we are based on some ancient achievements. We have to stand on what we are able to do today. And the only people who have got a Nobel Prize after independence are those who left India. After C.V. Raman,
Yeah.
And join the left bandwagon.
Yeah. No, no. I'm talking about scientists, no?
I'm talking about economists.
Yeah, there's only one of those, but I'm saying there are many Indian scientists who've got the Nobel Prize, and they could only do it abroad. You can't do, except for TIFR, one or two places, you can't really do cutting edge work even in science in India. And you can't throw money into the system and say, okay, now we'll keep our people. It's not so simple. So we have to be very honest. And if you're honest, sometimes you're disliked, because again, it seems as if, you're not giving a positive image. But image building.
Makarand, we went back from Vivekananda to other things where these things started. Now, and then, don't you think there's a problem here now? Academic institutions are being politicized now. They are looked at from the ideological point of view, as you pointed out in the beginning as well. Like Ashoka University. From the beginning, it started by somebody who's supposed to be American education. All the trustees were left because most of the people who are running good institutions, they have studied abroad and they have liberal point of view, which is sometimes turns out to be in the current atmosphere turns out to be anti-India, because from them definition is a different thing altogether. So what you're saying, PPP model, I'm coming back to. Why can't we stop the bottom up approach? Because you are talking, all of us are talking them top down, IITs, IEM, because they are the basic causes of creating this kind of monopoly of such a kind of thinking here, because they control the mind, as you say, mind. They're trying to mold the mind molding which is happening in this country, because they're resisting the Indianization of the Indian system which is happening. And that is why the people sitting at the top, there's the person you have, Niti Ayog, where the person who has gone to a particular college said that college should be privatized. So they're talking about good institutions to be privatized as well, because they think okay, that's the model. Okay, there's a private need for a private thing. But what is the education system we want? Why couldn't Japan import Western model? Japan is as nationalistic as we are, but why they are different than the rest of India? Think always in terms of Western technology. This imposition of Western technology, but nobody is thinking of bottom-up approach, how to change the system in the school. For 20 years from now, the school children will decide. NEP not handling that curriculum, what we are talking about it, that how to create the future people. At the moment process seems to be that people want to make Bharat into India. How can the process be reversed, make it convert, marginalize, minimize in India, maximize Bharat? That should be the educational system which Vivekananda was talking about.
Yeah, but it's easier said than done. If you look at transformation, it's always by a small group of highly motivated and energized people. Even in the freedom movement, this bottom up. I think Dr. Vaidya was talking about the Soviet revolution, even in China. But the leaders were all bourgeois. Lenin was bourgeois, Marx was bourgeois. No working class leader. Mao was a well off person. He came from an elite section of Chinese society.
Mahatma Gandhi, so was the Congress leadership.
Absolutely. We cannot expect people who don't have roti, kapda, and makan to suddenly, transform society. Please, let's not be under any illusion about this. Ultimately, the leadership will come from the middle classes. I won't say upper classes because many of them have become irrelevant now. It is still a vibrant and expanding middle class in India. And there are top down. Agastya International Foundation is working at the grassroots. There are people doing this and it can happen, but it can't happen without very high quality inputs. And it cannot happen without funding. And I like the Ashoka model because about 20, 30, 40 corporates got together, put their money. What's wrong with that? And, the issue is different. This cancel culture and what you call the ideologizing of higher education is possibly even a greater problem abroad because it's the liberals who are the most illiberal. Today, in the name of liberalism, they are completely intolerant of any idea, any view which does not conform to their idea of liberalism. So if you say universities should be places of free speech, then why did you prevent Richard Dawkins from speaking at Berkeley, which was supposed to be the forefront of student protests? Because he says something about a particular religion which offends a certain section of the liberal people. So you shut him out. So anybody you
Makarand, I gave you an example of mine last year before last. I was invited by Harvard to speak at one of their conferences. And later on, two students protested against me because I was a particular background and the invitation was withdrawn. And Nidhi Rajan was invited in my place.
But I think, see, I want to tell you, she suffered a worse fate than you can imagine. She got scammed for a job which didn't exist. So I think you got the better end of the bargain on a lighter note. But this intolerance in the name of liberalism, intolerance in the name of freedom of expression, is a worldwide danger. And I predict that this will bring down the West also. It's not that the West is safe, they are also deeply divided and threatened. And this is an opportunity for us in India, frankly. But I'm afraid to go back to your point. You see, we lack the political will to make fundamental changes. So we make cosmetic changes, frankly. And this is true of all ideologies, and all political parties. They appease in varying degrees. And maybe it's a political compulsion. So I don't want to be entirely negative. And maybe also certain things will take time, but you have to call a spade a spade. And frankly, it's no longer trickle down, top down, bottoms up. It is comprehensive. The need of the hour is for a comprehensive, you might say, rebooting, rejig, all these words, you can use any kind of word.
Re-engineering.
Reject, reboot. See, it's comprehensive. It's not a matter of yahan se shuru karo ya wahan se shuru karo. You start at any end, but you'll end up trying to do more or less the same things to cleanse the system, to stabilize the system where it works, to protect the system, to protect national institutions in which billions and billions of Indian rupees have been invested. Okay, you have to protect these institutions, which are being, as I said, destroyed as we speak because of interference, because of politics, because of a certain kind of unionization, because of a certain kind of communal slash caste slash linguistic politics, and this is where again we come back to Vivekananda, because he wanted an idea of national education. And we sometimes forget this, but when Swamiji traveled, from Bengal to other parts of India, how did he communicate with intellectuals? He communicated in Sanskrit. So, if you think that 24 languages will serve us, of course they'll serve us well at one level. But in India, we've always had two or three, so called languages of learning, which is what has unified us. So, Sanskrit should be revived, certainly, but English should not be rejected. English remains a very important link. It also gives you jobs. So people want to compare India with Japan. You can't compare India with Japan or Korea or even China. See, China imposed a form of Mandarin. And what they've done, therefore, is they've imposed one kind of language. And other countries are mostly monolingual. We are not. So we do need a national language. So English is important, Hindi is important, and maybe see, I'm all for translating, but you can't keep translating into 24 languages, because you can't get a person in some remote place saying it's my right that the latest should be available in my language, because even to do that you need somebody who can deliver that translation. So we'll tie ourselves up into circles. We do need some languages which are link languages, communication languages. We need Sanskrit, because without Sanskrit, the necklace of pearls that is Indian civilization will be scattered. This is what they wanted. You break that thread and the pearls are scattered. So you need some Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is a very inviting language. You don't have to do Vyakaran for 22 years or 12 years now. From the Hindi, the Tamil, the Telugu, whatever, Punjabi, Kashmiri, and we have so much apparatus. You can read a text. A well educated person today can pick up the Bhagavad Gita, can see a translation, can see the parsing, but the moment you grapple with it in the original, something happens, which you can't get from translation. So this can be done. A whole, if Israel adopted Hebrew, we can't do that quite because we're a small country. But we can learn, our children can learn. It's not the end of the world. But as I said, if you have the notion, of a national education, then it goes completely contrary to the current forces. And every politician wants to name a college after himself or his grandfather or grandmother. They're getting land, they're creating assets. So this is what's going on. We have thousands of colleges. We have 30,000 colleges in India now, something like that. More than 1,000 universities, more than 30, 40,000 colleges. But many of these cannot impart even, let alone knowing yourself, knowing your culture, transforming the world, consciousness revolution, you know, let alone all those fancy things, they cannot even teach the subject, which they're supposed to teach. This is the
Good,
sad
good,
truth. This is the
good.
sad truth.
Maybe a closing question, because the understanding the self is also, very important facet of Swamiji's message when it came to education. But given the fact that the last 1 year has been completely online education, where there has been a complete, disconnect between the teacher and the thought, while Swamiji in many of his writings has necessitated, the need for Guru Grahavasa. Now, of course, this is just maybe a small interim arrangement, but the way in which we are kind of celebrating this online education, I get a feeling that we are just intellectually paratrooping. Well, actually, we have to be foot soldiering and stay rooted to our a system of education. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. You look, it's very important what you said. Vivekananda actually, trained under the direct tutelage and supervision of Sri Ramakrishna. So for that kind of, if you want to create those kinds of, personalities, leaders, and right now I'm reading about Swamiji and Nivedita and the Himalayan journey, and how Swamiji, I was going to say taught, trained, and treated Nivedita, very hard education. So that is absolutely a must. There's no substitute. Now, if I'm in New Indian Express, I want to spend time with Mr. Chawla. I'm telling you. I'm not interested in anything else because I'm not going to learn, sitting at a copy desk. I want to be in touch with someone who has lived through decades of transformation of Indian journalism. And if I'm in, Shastra University, I will identify, if I'm a young student and I'm speaking to younger students, I will identify the teachers who inspire me. I will keep taking their courses. I will try to be in their sanidhyam. So there is no substitute. You're absolutely right. And the simple thing is the machine cannot produce the dhwani, you see, even when you want to give Guru Diksha, Guru Mantram, it's not done through a machine. Today we are outsourcing. You see, there's a death in my family. Let's say I'm abroad. I pay somebody, I do an e-puja, and some pandit is chanting somewhere, and all my work is done. That I mean, I don't know if tarpana can be offered that way. I don't know. But I think no. I think you need the contact. But at the same time, this is a great opportunity. We have dematerialized the university, the brick and mortar university, the so-called, these Ivy Leagues, and even in India, versions of the Ivy Leagues, where entry is itself so difficult. You can't get inside. Now all the lectures are available online. At Indian Institute of Advanced Study, we were like this at Ivory Tower. So I went to a number of people. I just had a wonderful conversation with the consortium of consortium for educational communication, CEC, headed by Mr. Jagat Bhushan Nanda, JB Nanda, not JP, who is the BJP president, but his brother. Anyhow, we want to make all our content available, okay, through digital platforms, through direct to home, through Gyan, through Swayam, through all these new platforms on your TV channels. Now, what does this mean? The best speakers in India who have come here or who have joined us through webinar, instead of making content exclusive, we want to open it up. And this is also true of Harvard and Yale and Oxford. More and more content will be available online. And a person who's determined to educate themselves, they may be better educated without a certificate by following some of these lectures than someone who's going through an ordinary university. Now, this is when we have to scale it up. And I think NEP and other, wonderful initiatives of the government. Here, I'm unreservedly an admirer of some of these proposals where you can get a degree, you can fulfill curricular requirements by, watching these lectures on your TV. There are at least 30, 40 dedicated channels. So I think this is a very good practice because we must have lifelong learning. As I said, India is a knowledge society. Let us remove the barriers to knowledge. For me, digital opening up of educational sector is a wonderful democratization. So, to conclude, I feel we need both. We need excellence, uncompromising excellence, contact with unique teachers. We need good institutions. We need excellence once more. We need to depoliticize education. We need to nationalize the character, etc. At the same time, through these other mechanisms, we can open up more and more and more. And here, I think all of us have a role to play, because whether we are in the media, such as Mr. Chawla and Kaveri, whether we are in education in the private sector, whether we are in education in the government sector, we need to work together, and to make our best content available to everybody.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to listen to you. And I look forward to a time where you can devise and teach a course on Hinduism online. And I think all of us will definitely sign up for it. Thank you very much, Makarand Paranjape. Thank you very much, Dr. Vaidya. Thank you very much, Mr. Chawla.
Thank you.
We hope you really enjoyed that session. You can find the entire schedule of ThinkEdu 2021 on our website, eventexpress.com. You can watch the rest of the sessions on our YouTube channel, eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com and edxlive.com. You can also check out our Facebook and Twitter handles. Thank you for watching.